Right, good morning everyone. Can everybody hear me okay at the back? Perfect. So for those of you that don't know me, my name's Tong and I work in the sales engineering team at Sophos. I'm typically aligned to both public sector and enterprise customers across the north of the UK. And before working as a sales engineer, I used to help design, configure and implement security strategies for Sophos customers in the professional services team. Today what I've been asked to do is to come in and present to you the ever-evolving threat landscape, but through the eyes of our own dedicated labs team at Sophos. So at Sophos, what we have is a labs team who follow the sun 24/7, 365. So unfortunately, the bad guys don't sleep, so neither do we. And ultimately, what the labs are responsible for doing is analysing everything that takes place across the whole World Wide Web from a security perspective to provide layers of protection to the 150 million users that trust Sophos to stay protected year on year. What I'm going to do is I'm going to share the threat landscape from an endpoint and server perspective initially, and then I'll finish off talking a little bit about mobile security, which is part of my passion at the minute. But before I talk about the current threat landscape, I always feel it's important to take a look at the history of malware so we can really truly appreciate how it's evolved over time and why our security strategy needs to evolve along with it. So I've pulled up a couple of really early pieces of malware. The first one is something called I'm a Creeper, Catch Me If You Can, if you can see what I've done there. I'm a Creeper, Catch Me If You Can is arguably the first ever piece of malware we ever saw, and what that malware did was jump onto a system with a message that you can see and then propagate throughout the network to other devices. Fast forward a little bit, moving to the 80s and 90s, we then saw malware strains such as Cascade. And what Cascade did was infect COM files and ultimately do what you guys can see on screen right now, which is drop the content to the base of the screen. In the early days, the vast majority of malware was delivered to show what was possible through computing and computer programming, typically to gain credit from the IT community or to cause a nuisance. Neither of these two malware strains caused any long-lasting damage, and there was no financial implication associated with them whatsoever. Unfortunately though, if we fast forward to the present day, the landscape as we know it has significantly shifted. And I'm only touching on the surface here, but to give you a few examples as to the type of threats we now have to deal with, I'll start with phishing. So unfortunately, the days of dear sirs, please send monies when it comes to phishing are long gone. The hackers, the malware writers are much more educated, and we're starting to see malware and phishing campaigns that really look the part. But what they're also looking to do now is using social engineering techniques to really lure users into becoming the next victim. And in this example, it looks really, really good from an Instagram perspective, but what they're trying to lure you in is by pretending that multi-factor authentication is in use. The other thing that we've seen an awful lot of is our CPU cycles being stolen by malware and hackers. With the boom of the cryptocurrency like Bitcoin, Litecoin and Ethereum over the course of the last few years, we've seen our devices get hijacked and our devices be used to mine that cryptocurrency. Equally, our devices becoming part of a botnet where they're used for attacks such as denial of service attacks throughout the world. Ransomware. Everybody in this room will be familiar with ransomware. Ransomware is encrypting files en masse throughout large organisations, and unless you have backups to recover from, the only way to get your data back is through paying the ransom to the malware writers and hackers. Banking Trojans are another issue. So with keyloggers and banking Trojans, the malware writers and hackers are looking to take our bank account details and essentially look to empty our bank accounts until there's nothing left in there, whether that be personal or corporate. And then malware writers and hackers are well aware that our most critical assets is our data, both from a commercial perspective with our top level company secrets, but also with the likes of GDPR, the fact that we have to ensure that our data is kept secure. So we've seen a whole host of additional malware type attacks. The landscape has changed. It's no longer about credit, QDOS, causing a nuisance or to see what's possible. It's now a multi-billion-dollar industry. And in fact, in 2018 alone, the Centre for Strategic and International Studies, alongside McAfee, reported that the estimated cost of cybercrime was upwards of £600 billion last year. So we've really seen a massive shift where more or less every single malware attack we see now is there to try and line the pockets of those malware writers and hackers. We enlisted a third-party independent survey from Sophos across 3,100 IT managers throughout Europe, and some of the statistics that we got back were rather interesting. The first thing that we noted was that 68% of organisations reported at least one cybersecurity breach within the last calendar year. But what's even more interesting is the larger the organisation, the more likely you are to be impacted. So we saw that any company with 1,001 employees or more, were 73% of those were hit by malware attacks and cyber attacks in their environment. What's also interesting with this is that 9 out of 10 of all of those organisations reported running up-to-date traditional antivirus at the moment that they were impacted. So this slide for me kind of tells two things. It tells you firstly that traditional AV is obviously not strong enough alone to help prevent the threats that we're seeing in the current day. But secondly, what it also tells us is that the larger the organisation, the more likely you are to be impacted. So when you're planning your security strategy, you should be really thinking about planning with the idea that it's almost certain that you are going to be impacted at some point. Following that stance gives you a greater opportunity to put a layered security approach in place to ensure that hopefully you're not one of those percentage figures. Within our labs alone, in 2019, we've seen over 500,000 zero-day threats on a daily basis. And if we put things into context and look back at the history, Sophos was first formed around 1980, and we used to report roughly tens of thousands of malware samples per year. So fast forward to today, we're now seeing more per day than we were per every couple of years in terms of the threat landscape. The interesting statistic in relation to the amount of threats that we see is that 75% of threats are only seen inside one organisation. So what that tells us, we're seeing a massive shift away from spray and pray. While spray and pray in terms of sending out malware to as many people as possible is still highly lucrative, we're seeing a big shift towards specific targeted attacks. We're also analysing upwards of 150,000 URLs, and I think what you'll all find most interesting is that over half of the attacks that we now see do not get delivered onto an endpoint through a malicious executable. So what we're talking about here is we're seeing the malware writers and hackers change their tactics and shift down the route of fileless malware, script-based attacks and the likes. On that note, the vast majority of advanced malware that we now see that doesn't rely on files, they typically leverage software vulnerabilities in order to infect your system and cause some damage. So for those of you that are not familiar with the term software vulnerability, the easiest way to describe it would be it's a bug in software code that a malware writer or a hacker will try and use to cause damage to your system. We've seen the volume of vulnerabilities that are being reported year on year significantly increase, in particular since 2016, to the point that in 2019, we now estimate that there'll be 18,500 reported vulnerabilities. The reason for sharing this slide is not so much about the amount of vulnerabilities that we see, it's that I wanted to share with you the average length of time that it takes an organisation to apply a patch once a patch has been released by a vendor. And that number is a staggering 193 days. So to put that into human context, it's a little bit like living on a street that's renowned for burglaries and leaving the window in your house open for 193 days, hoping that someone doesn't climb in. So I'm going to mention this a few times through the presentation. One of the key points I want to get across today is that patching is critical, and what we really need to be doing is patching as early and as often as possible, because having an average of 193 days is just not acceptable across the whole IT community. There are many reasons why the landscape has significantly increased, and most of you will be familiar with the fact that the attack surface has significantly evolved. If we were around 20 or 30 years, we typically had servers and endpoints to look after, but in the present day, we're now having to look after laptops and roaming users. Mobile phones are now almost as powerful, if not more powerful, than some devices that we have. A lot of our infrastructure is moving up into the cloud. We've got a lot of virtualization. Essentially, the landscape and the targets that malware writers and hackers go after have increased that much that we're seeing more and more malware writers and hackers look to deliver malware into customer environments. The other reason we've seen a huge increase is that we've seen malware writers and hackers start to use more sophisticated techniques. And one of the slides I gave earlier that talks about 50% of malware no longer being executable based gives a good example of that. But some of the things that we're now seeing from a sophistication perspective is the use of zero-day exploits, so those vulnerabilities that I alluded to, and it's also the introduction of polymorphic and metamorphic malware. And I won't get into the detail of exactly how those two work, but I will talk through why that has seen a huge increase in malware on the next slide. So polymorphic malware, and there's a little bit more to it than how I'm putting it, but I'll simplify it a little bit. Polymorphic malware is the concept that once a user has downloaded a malicious executable, that we mutate that malware so it's different for the next person. So in the example that I've got here, let's imagine we've got a user on a laptop and he wants to connect to a web server, and when he connects to that web server, a drive-by download takes place and a malicious executable is downloaded. So when the user browses to the website, the malicious executable will have a fingerprint or a file hash or a SHA-256 file hash, whatever term we want to use. What instantly happens is a mutation as part of that particular malware code changes so that the next time someone browses to that site, whether it be the same user or a different user, the fingerprint is now completely different. So if you take traditional AV as an example, the way that a lot of traditional AV typically worked is that once we'd seen a threat, we release a fingerprint or a virus definition file for that in order to clean up. So you can start to see why traditional AV is struggling to keep up when we're seeing techniques such as these used to try and bypass traditional AV components. Another reason that we've seen a huge increase in the amount of malware out there is that malware writers and hackers have shifted over to business models. So what we're seeing an awful lot of is malware as a service, things such as ransomware as a service or phishing as a service, where the hackers and malware writers will create a website and offer a service to non-technical people so that they can in turn get involved in the cyber criminal enterprise. The example that I've got up on screen is something that's referred to as Satan, and that is a ransomware as a service variant. The way that it works and the way that the business model works is a user can sign up to become a cyber criminal to deliver ransomware onto end users' devices. They pay an initial fee to sign up, they work through a wizard that creates the malicious malware for them, and then they also set whatever they want the ransomware payment to be. The criminals then take a percentage payment from every single ransomware payment that's been made. So by cyber criminals having solutions such as this, what it allows them to do is have a greater outreach but put the onus on other people. The crazy thing with this is that they're run so much like businesses that we even see roadmaps for different types of versions. They typically offer service level agreements to ensure percentage uptime. It's something that's rife and we're seeing significantly increase. So from a threat landscape perspective, our Sophos lab shared the following kind of chart with me, and the landscape has changed quite significantly over the course of the last few years. If we rewound, let's say, between 5 and 10 years ago, the vast proportion of malware that we would have seen would have been made up of what we refer to as generic malware. Think of generic malware as something that's well averse to traditional antivirus through the use of signatures and whatnot. As mentioned earlier in the slide deck, malware writers and hackers will look for more sophisticated techniques in order to bypass that. So the vast majority of the threat landscape we see today is either made up of active adversary malware. So the best way to think of that is where a hacker has somehow managed to get a connection in your environment. It's looking for the behaviour they would typically try and perform. So trying to steal password credentials or move laterally throughout an estate. It's also made up of advanced malware. So a good example of advanced malware would be malware that typically has multiple stages to its attack chain. So maybe a piece of malware that gets on an endpoint, it tries to steal some password credentials, it then looks to move laterally, it then looks to perform encryption. And then finally, the other part of the threat landscape is ransomware. So ransomware is still very much alive and kicking. And from a delivery mechanism perspective, what our labs have shared with us is the main entry points for the malware that we're actually seeing. So I don't think it'll be much of a surprise to more or less anybody in this room in that the vast proportion of malware is still delivered through both email and through web filtering. So what that highlights to us is we really need to be looking to ensure that we've got the relevant security controls in place at the network perimeter. So things such as sandboxing files that have never ever been seen before, to ensure that before we let them into the network, we know that they're not malicious, or we've got a very good prediction that they're almost certainly not going to be. But the main reason for sharing this slide is there are 3 points. Software vulnerabilities makes up 23% of all of the attack chains that we now see. So when I was talking about the 18,500 vulnerabilities that we saw earlier, and I was trying to encourage people to patch as early and often as possible, that's because more or less 25% of everything that we now see uses a vulnerability in order to impact your system. The other thing that, I'll be honest, really surprised me was that USB keys in external devices are still used as a delivery mechanism for 14% of attacks, which I thought was quite insane when I got that. What that's more or less implying to us is that not enough people are using USB or peripheral control either through their traditional AV or through extra functionality. It's still absolutely rife. I was only speaking to a customer earlier on who does a little bit of pen testing internal themselves, where they put numerous files on a USB key, blocked all USB keys in their console, and just wrote payroll on the USB key to see how many people would plug it in. Every single USB key got plugged in. So I think that just paints a bit of a picture, and that's from the conversation that I had today. But the strangest statistic, or the most alarming, is that 20% of people don't have any idea how they got infected. So they know they were infected, they're working through a cleanup process, but they've got no idea how that threat got in, therefore no idea how to potentially stop them being a victim again. So what you really need to be looking for when you're looking at your antivirus solutions is ensuring that you've got a solution that gives you that full telemetry of the full attack chain from the point that we detected the attack to whatever the root cause or the initial entry of that attack would be. So what I want to do is just give a few examples of a couple of pieces of malware that are rife at the minute and are causing customers significant problems. And one of them is a piece of malware that's referred to as Emotet. According to the US Department of Homeland Security in 2018, they actually reported it as the biggest risk to businesses in the United States of America. And we're actually seeing in the UK 300 plus brand new variants of Emotet every single day. Emotet is essentially a sophisticated Trojan that's been around for around about 5 years, and in its first form it was renowned for being a banking Trojan. And what it would do is get on an endpoint and it would download and deliver typically TrickBox or dry decks that would look to steal your banking credentials and essentially empty your bank account dry. The challenge with it now is that it's evolved so much that it's used for a huge proportion of malware attacks as a delivery mechanism for numerous different malware payloads. And the most recent ones that we've seen have delivered through what's referred to as Megacortex and RYUK, which are ransomware strains. The biggest challenge with Emotet, again, is it's quite often used as a bit of a smokescreen. So what happens is it gets into your environment, it'll download up to 20 or 30 different malware payloads. Whilst you're trying to deal with or investigate that, they'll then hit you with something completely different. So once that gets in, it's really destructive in terms of what it does. And you can see how it's advanced given the fact that it has multiple stages in terms of the delivery mechanism. Another massive challenge to all organisations, it's been this way for a while and it will remain this way for quite some time, is ransomware. Following that recent survey that we did, we found that 44% of organisations reported at least one ransomware infection. We found that, again, 9 out of 10 were running out up-to-date antivirus software. And alarmingly, the average cost of the business in terms of brand reputation damage, clean-up, admin cost, etc., was £100,000 per threat. Unfortunately, ransomware itself has had its own evolution journey. So in the early days, ransomware that we typically saw was very, very destructive. What it would do is it would infect a system and more or less encrypt every file or folder, including file names throughout the entirety of your estate. But what the hackers found was, whilst that was good, because they knew that people would need to recover, they weren't able to actually browse through their file system to see which files they'd lost that were really important to them. So we saw it evolve to only go after file types that businesses typically use, but to leave the metadata such as file names open so that you can see what you're missing. Fast forward several years, we arguably saw one of the most famous cyber attacks in recent history with the likes of WannaCry, which evolved ransomware again to use worm-like technologies, leveraging the Eternal Blue vulnerability. WannaCry was so successful, it was able to infect 240,000 devices in 150 countries in less than 24 hours. Unfortunately, though, it hasn't stopped there. What we've recently seen is a new delivery mechanism. So a small but sophisticated group of cyber criminals have been working on targeted attacks for organisations by using RDP access and by brute forcing passwords. And whilst a lot of organisations will have long, complex passwords that they may only use in one system and they don't use anywhere else, the challenge that we have with this group of cyber criminals is they typically look for the low-hanging fruit, so devices in your environment that have weak passwords, and then in turn use that to get into your network, and then use commonly available open source tools like Mimikatz, for example, to sniff out domain credentials. Once they've got those domain credentials, they then sit there and wait for an opportune moment to kick off a ransomware attack when it's likely that most people will be out of the business, so maybe Friday at 7 o'clock at night or a Saturday afternoon. They've been that successful over the last 3 years that they've actually been able to make over £6.3 million in profit. And where there's profit for one cyber syndicate group, there are copycats. So what we've now seen is that alongside SamSam and numerous other cyber syndicates such as Grand Crab and Dharma, that are all using the same technique. So essentially what they are doing is looking for victims to target using open source tools that are readily available or accessible on the dark web that more or less tells them every single server that's accessible over remote desktop over the whole internet, and then they're just using those passwords and relentlessly continuing. To give an example as to the sort of threat that we face, at Sophos we set up 10 honeypots in AWS throughout 10 regions across Europe, with the key goal to be to analyse the amount of login attempts that we actually saw. And over 30 days we saw 4.3 million login attempts across those 10 servers, which broken down equates to 10 login attempts per server per minute. In fact, the very first login attempt that we saw after spinning up a server in the cloud in AWS was in less than 2 seconds. So, you know, the malware writers and hackers are sat there monitoring what's going on in the World Wide Web and trying to gain access to any public-facing servers that you have with RDP. And to my knowledge, by default, AWS typically has RDP open. So it's something we really need to take good care and consideration of. So from an endpoint point of view, I just want to end with a few security advisories, and then I'll move on to a little bit more about the mobile threat landscape. So I've probably got this point across a few times and it may sound a little bit like rinse and repeat, but from a security point of view, traditional antivirus on its own is no longer good enough. What you need to be doing is looking for zero-day protection that can complement traditional antivirus. So what I'm talking about is software that can cater for different types of ransomware attacks and help you roll your files back. I'm talking about protection against exploits that try and use the 18,500 vulnerabilities that we think we'll see this year. From an IT security best practice, I've said this 3 times, we need to patch early and patch as often as we possibly can. Given what we've talked about brute forcing of passwords, we need to ensure that we're using long, complex passwords. But what's also really, really critical is we need to ensure that our domain admin credentials aren't used on servers that have access to the public internet, because when a hacker gets in that environment, it only takes a second for them to scrape them credentials and they've got the full keys to your kingdom. The other thing to consider, and I think one of the most often overlooked features from a traditional antivirus point of view, is application control. And even if you only use application control to block PowerShell and Windows scripting, even if you only use it for that, you're significantly cutting the threat landscape probably by about 40%. And the reason for that is most of the malware we see these days uses that as part of its delivery mechanism. And I haven't talked much about the network layer today, other than the fact that the vast majority of threats come through web and email. but it's important that you look and ensure that you have next generation capabilities at the gateway layer, because ideally we stop all threats before they come in. And if you're fortunate enough, an ideal scenario would be to have a solution whereby your endpoint components talk to the network to automate security and to share threat intelligence between the two. So what I want to do now is I want to move on and talk a little bit about the mobile threat landscape. So for me, this is something I'm really, really passionate about, and it's one of the most overlooked IT security features that there is out there. Whilst I'm not going to sit here and tell you that the cyber threat landscape for mobile is anywhere near the size of what I've just talked about from a device perspective, we've seen an increase of 2,900% since 2012 in terms of the amount of malware that we see. And to give a few examples as to the type of threats that we're now seeing on mobile, we've got phishing, much like what we saw on an endpoint. What the malware writers and hackers look to do is leverage the fact that the devices and the screens render slightly differently. And I know it's quite difficult to see this, but what they've done is they've put a long URL that starts off with Apple-ID and loads of numbers that if a user didn't click on wouldn't realise that the actual URL is something completely different. We've also seen an abundance of smishing attacks, or smishing attacks that are sent out either to trick you on clicking the link or to hope that you reply, where extortionate fees can be charged. They only need to charge, let's say, $60 for a reply text to 100 users, and you can see how lucrative that can be. Unfortunately, mobile devices now contain a huge amount of our company data. As they become more powerful, and they're now using a lot of organisations instead of laptops, they contain all of our emails, typically company documents, etc., etc. So from a malware writer and hacker perspective, what they'll try and do is install a Trojan that can leak all of that data outside your environment. Ransomware is also a problem on mobile phones. So whilst it may not work in the same way quite often as it does on Windows, Mac or Linux devices, even ransomware that just changes the passcode means that you can't get into that operating system and gain access to any of your files. And then the other thing that we see an awful lot of is the devices being taken over as part of a bot network, or even again to do things such as mine cryptocurrency. Because mobile phones are on all the time, quite often they can hide deep in the operating system, constantly mining cryptocurrency whilst draining your battery without you actually realising. And that's just a few. I'm just touching on the surface there with the time that I've got. So there are three kind of key main attack vectors when it comes to mobile. The first one that we have is what we refer to as device level. And this is typically an attack vector where hackers will look to leverage the fact that you may not have pushed out the latest patch on your operating system. So I'm talking about patching again. But patching on the operating system, we're also talking about zero-day vulnerabilities that people don't know. For anybody that allows or has end users that jailbreak their phone, that puts you at significant risk because that reduces more or less all of the inbuilt operating system support from a security point of view. So one delivery mechanism is a device, and then the one that most people will be most familiar with is applications being infected with malware. So we've seen a huge amount of mobile malware that's delivered through app stores and or through compromised apps. Quite often, a lot of customers don't limit or block the ability to sideload applications, and allowing sideloaded applications essentially means that you can download an app from anywhere when it's not even been through the security controls that the Play Store for Google would use or the iOS App Store would use for Apple. And then the third mechanism to consider is kind of the network level. So a lot of attacks, as mentioned, are delivered through phishing, which would fall under this. But with mobile phones, because they're constantly out and about on the road and they're connected to different masks and different Wi-Fi, a huge concern is man-in-the-middle attacks. It would not be difficult to go out and set up your own mini network for someone to connect to, and therefore snoop into all of the network traffic to gain usernames and passwords and whatnot for that particular device. We've also seen compromises through the use of Bluetooth and NFC. So I want to end by providing kind of 6 key takeaway points really from a mobile perspective. And the first one is we really need to be looking to implement, at the very least, mobile security. Most customers will already have mobile device management in play, And whilst mobile device management can help you prevent the routing of a device, can help you push out Wi-Fi profiles and lock email containers, it doesn't provide you with antivirus functionality that can get rid of the threats that are most concerning. The other thing is try to stick to official app stores. So whilst this isn't going to stop all threats, because they have inbuilt security where they scan a lot of mobile apps before they come into the store, it can clear out a lot of the malware threats. However, the challenge with it is a lot of apps these days, to get around signature-based scanning when they're added to an app store, will more or less create their application as a browser. So when it's scanned, there's nothing malicious, but when you're using the app, it's connecting to sites that are. So preventing side loading is a good piece of advice, but it isn't the silver bullet. Patch early and patch often. You're probably fed up with me saying that. And also, what you want to do is ensure that bring your own devices, if you support them, are on a completely different network segment to any corporate devices. We've seen use cases where mobile phones have been infected external to your organisation, and when they've come in, if they're part of the same corporate network, can then pivot onto laptop devices, onto other mobile devices to wreak havoc throughout your environment. And then the final two is user education, and I think that falls part of both endpoint and mobile threats. We really need to be doing more to educate our users, in particular around the things that they need to be looking out for when it comes to phishing, and if things don't seem right, they're almost certainly not right. And I'll finish off by repeating myself with point 6, because there's only 5 on this slide, and that is use mobile security. I feel it's really, really important. So in terms of my presentation, that's conclude. What I will say is if you've got any questions on what I presented today, or you want to discuss any Sophos products that can help overcome this, come and give us a shout on the Sophos booth a little bit later. Thank you, everyone.